everyone, Roger here from Ask the Car Experts. I had a subscriber reach out to me last night. He has a BMW X3 and he replaced the starter and everything seemed to be okay for a short time, and then the vehicle ended up with a no crank, no start once again. And that's actually pretty common on the X3 and a lot of BMWs. You can have a bad starter, but there's usually another underlying condition, or sometimes it's actually caused from something else. I'm going to go over some steps and some tips on how to make sure that you're not going to misdiagnose a starter, and to check and make sure that the problem is not actually a starter to begin with. I'm also going to show you some quick and easy test steps to help identify that the issue is or is not a starter. Alright, let me get started. Alright, like you would suspect, the first thing to check is your battery. So I have just a voltmeter, and it's set to 20 for DC voltage. Depending on your voltmeter, this might be a little bit different, but you want to make sure you're on DC and you want to be in the 20 range. You might have an auto one. And the first thing to check is your battery good? Alright, so we should see 12 volts here on the voltmeter. And I'm just going to go from the positive side to the negative. And I have 11.79, so I have to charge this battery, but that should be enough to crank it over. I can also put a jump pack on it, and I know for a fact that the vehicle will not crank. Alright, so my battery has voltage. That's step one. Now you always want to make sure that your cables are tight on both terminals. You can even loosen them, clean the terminal, put them back on, and check your ground here at the battery. If you have a loose terminal, you can have a voltage drop, and that's just from it moving around while you're driving, and it can create a arcing between the pole and the actual cable, and that can actually cause what's called a voltage drop, and I can show you that right now. So to check for a voltage drop with my voltmeter, I'm going to actually go from the center of the pole right here on my battery to my actual housing or my connector, and I should be able to see it. I'm trying not to block the camera, but basically I'm going to go from the center to the outside, and I have 11.4 volts. Now that means that there's a voltage drop. I am losing 11.4 volts between here and here. And you can check that also on your ground to your body. Let me back out. So here's my ground to my body. If I go from the center here to my ground, right, I shouldn't see anything. That's called a voltage drop test, and I should see maybe less than half a volt realistically. I'm seeing 11.49. So if you see voltage using a voltmeter here, that means that you have a voltage drop. So let's take a look why. Alright, pull my negative cable off. Well, that's because I've put electrical tape around the terminal. Alright, and that was for the purpose of the video. So if I put that back on, I don't even really need to tighten it yet, because it takes a while for arcing to occur and a voltage drop to occur. So now if I go from my positive to my negative, what do I got? 0. That means I have no voltage drop, and that means my connection is now good. So that's the first thing that you should check. Now keep in mind some common things it can also be is it could actually be your key, because your key sends a signal to, at least in the E46, to the EWS, to the coil ring here, to allow the starter to start. It sends an enable signal once all of the communication verifies that the rolling code in the key matches. If you have a manual transmission, you'd have to make sure that your clutch switch works, and I'm going to assume that those things are good. Also, if you don't have a manual, make sure that your cluster shows that you're in park. So right now, with my foot on the clutch, I know that's not the problem because I've set up the bug obviously. I can turn my key on, everything lights up nice and bright, and I get nothing. I got no crank, no click, and that tells me that either my starter is dead, which is what most people think, or I have some other kind of problem. And I know for a fact in this car that there is another problem, and it is not the starter, but this is an often misdiagnosed situation where people replace the starter. Let me just go over quick on what you'd need if you wanted to check at the starter. On an E46 and other cars, it is somewhat difficult to get to the starter. But you'd have to do it, or you'd have to find a connector to verify that you're getting voltage to the starter solenoid. You should have power going to the main large gauge wire to your starter, and that should be battery voltage, should be there all the time. And then you have a smaller wire that goes to the solenoid that activates the starter, and you should only have voltage there when someone holds the key into the run position, and that would release the power to the solenoid. And if everything checks out, key and DME communicate, then it will allow the engine to crank over. So we're going to assume that that is good. Or actually what you should be doing is these other tests first before going and digging into a starter, because sometimes you have to take the intake manifold off to get to a starter, or in this car you have to drop the exhaust. I mean, I could get to it if I take all this apart here. You can actually get to it. You have to take the throttle boot and the diesel valve off. But I know my starter is good, so realistically you should start with these steps that I'm going to show you first before going after the starter. Alright, next thing I'm going to check with my voltmeter. I'm going to check my power up to my jump terminal here. The jump terminal actually is a connection that goes over, and this is what connects to your starter. So you actually want to make sure that this is good. So I'm going to check here. There is corrosion. This car is an older car, but I should see battery voltage or close to it. Even the ground's kind of corroded. Let me scrape them on, see if I get a good reading. So there we go. We have, it says a negative, that's just because I have the positive on the negative side. 11.5, so that's basically what I had in my battery. So I have good voltage up until this point. Alright, so my car should start, right? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't start. So what are some other things you can check? And I have a great easy step that I'll show you shortly on how to check this, but let's just see. If I go from my positive here, and let me move the camera so you can see. There we go. So if I go from positive here to any ground point on the engine is basically what I'm looking for, right? And I should see the same voltage. And let me put this here. Let's see if you can see it too. Can you see that? Yes and no. Let's come in a little bit. I'll tell you what it says. The angle's a little off in the dark garage. So, all right, so I'm going to go from my positive to a ground, and I have 7 volts, 2 volts, 8 volts. That's jumping around a little bit. So if you see something like that and you're not seeing a good 12 volt signal, you've got to say to yourself, something doesn't seem right here. All right, what could that be? So now I'm going to do a voltage drop from the negative to the negative. So I'm going to go from the ground side, once I get untangled, here to my ground on my engine. And I should see 0 volts. And I'm getting 2.8 volts. So 2.7, still 2.8. Alright, so I have 2.8 was my highest. So I have a voltage drop on my ground side between my battery and my engine. And that's a problem. So if you have a test light, I would use a test light next. I like test lights. Some people don't like to use test lights. I think they give you really good information. I prefer ones that actually have a bulb inside and not a digital display or an LED. An LED is not going to give you amperage. It will tell you you have 11 volts, but it'll be 11 volts. You can't see if it lights the light bright, dim, or what. So amperage is really going to help determine what's going on, and it can help you diagnose the problem in some instances. So I'm going to go to my ground, I'm going to go to my battery. okay? And that's pretty bright. So I have good amperage up to here. All right, and I should expect to see between my ground and my positive, that should light, okay? Now if I go from positive to engine ground, it should light here, right? And it does. Let me show you that. So if I go from my positive side to my ground, it should be lit nice and bright. Or to my engine ground here, same thing. So let's take a look. And I see what the brightness is there and the brightness is here. And I don't know if you can tell, but that's actually a little dimmer than right here. So again, that tells me there's something going on, and it's probably not my starter. All right, so there's another interesting test you can do with the test light. Let me show you that next. All right, so I'm gonna go from my ground terminal, and on your X3, Dave, you're gonna just go from your jump terminal on your ground, and then take your test light, and you might need another person, but you're just gonna hold it up to any engine ground, right? So from ground to ground, you should see nothing. It should not light anything. And look, I have a little bit of light there. Why would I have voltage from ground to ground, right? What would create something like that? And the reason is, just like on the terminal, when I had the electrical tape and I went across those two terminals and you saw the 12 volts, it's the same reason. The path of voltage is actually going through my test light because it's finding the path of least resistance. So that means that I have a voltage drop. Now sometimes you'll see nothing here, and the only time you'll actually see a nice bright signal is when and I'm going to try to cheat here. Alright, so I have that connected there so that we can watch this a little bit better, and we can watch this light. Hopefully I can see it from inside the car. So what you're going to want to do, Dave, is set up a test light or a voltmeter on your body jump terminal ground to a ground on the engine, and I'm just using alligator clips. And then at the same time, you're going to have somebody step on the brake and try to crank the engine over. And I'm going to go hop in the car and do that now. And hopefully we can see what happens with that light. Wow, look at that. It's getting bright. Key off, key on. Key off, key on. So, that means I'm getting a lot of amperage when I turn my key. That doesn't make sense. I'm on the ground side. I shouldn't see anything there. It should not light at all. So what that means is you have a bad engine ground. That's really what we're testing for. Okay, now there is a really cool, easy trick to do to also test if you have a bad engine ground. I do like to do these tests here because this is really the right way to check. But let me show you a quick and easy test on how to check your engine ground. Alright, so I picked up these heavy-duty jumper cables from Harbor Freight, and this is the first time I'm using. Alright, so why jumper cables? And no, I'm not going to be jumping the car. That's actually not the purpose I'm going to be using these jumper cables for. I'm only going to be using one side, meaning either red and red or black and black. I'm going to use black and black because we're going to be on the ground side. So I'm not going to go and jump my car to another car. It's the same thing as using a jump pack, and I know the car is not going to start. But what you can use jumper cables for is to create your own ground, to prove that your ground is bad. Alright, and I often use this at the same concept at work. Alright, so I'm going to go to the jump terminal here, and I'm going to put my jumper cable, the ground side, on my ground. Okay, make sure I'm on there. I think I am. Alright, so again, I'm using the black wire. So here's my black. And the red, I'm not going to even use it. I don't need it, right? This is my red. Don't need it. Close that. I'm going to take my other side and I'm going to find another good metal spot on the engine, and I'm going to go ahead and attach to that spot. And hopefully that's going to be a good spot, right? Now, if I take my test light and go from my ground here, you can see I don't have any light, right? That's what I should see. I should see no voltage going through this. Nothing going through my test light. All right, so that's it. That's how I'm going to leave it. Make sure it's clear in the front, nothing's going to get caught. And I'm on jump terminal ground with black, and I'm on any kind of metal spot on your engine. And basically what I'm doing is, remember, your engine is isolated from the rest of the car except for a ground strap. Your ground strap is what attaches it to the chassis. And that's what creates the full connection. Same thing if you have a trailer hitch, right? Here's my car, here's my trailer hitch, and I have the ball socket that the trailer has to attach to. If I'm disconnected and hanging on the ground and I have my wires connected, nothing's going to light. It's not going to work because it uses the ball socket as your ground. So when you hook it up to your car, it completes the circuit, and then all of the lighting works, right? And that's basically what we're doing here. We're creating an additional ground. I'm going to hop in the car and we'll see if this cranks over. Alright, well, it didn't crank. Alright, so try to get a better connection here on my positive. Let's lift this up one more time here and go with, right, so I'm on ground and ground. That's my jump terminal ground, and then I just have another spot on the chassis for my ground. Alright, I did only have 11.5, so I threw my jump pack on, the battery in the back, and I really think that's what's going on. Let's see. There we go. So that is absolutely it. That proves that I have a bad ground for my engine. Alright, so that's how you check, and you saw, I mean, really the best test is to use a test light and to use a voltmeter to check if you have a bad ground. And then you can use a cable to verify if you have good, strong jumper cables. You could start with the jumper cables. If you don't have good jumper cables and you have like the thin ones, sometimes there's not enough if the amperage can't go through that well enough, and you can still end up with the same problem and misdiagnose it. That's really why you should use a test light or a voltmeter to check between your ground and your ground while somebody cranks it. Remember, you saw how it was a dim light, you might not have any light, and then when you crank it, it should be nice and bright, and that's if you're from ground to ground, that proves you have an engine ground. So let's take a look at the engine ground on this car and see what's going on. So I'm under my E46, and this is my main problem right here. I took the nut off the ground, and this is the fix to put this back on. Now, on your X3, Dave, you are going to have a braided metal ground strap, and you're going to find it under the car, or if you look down on the top, and I'm trying to remember if it's on the left or right side. I want to say it's on the driver's side all the way down, and sometimes you can see it from the top, and if you grab a hold of that ground strap and just give it a slight wiggle, it's probably going to crumble, which is very common. It gets corroded and it just falls apart in your hand. So that's probably the problem on your particular situation where you've replaced the starter and had a secondary failure of a no crank again. Your ground strap is corroded, and that is an often, unfortunately, misdiagnosed situation even from experienced people. So I know to always check for it, just because I've even been burned on it a long time ago, and it's something that I always check religiously now. Check your battery connections, and then do all the testing that I showed you in the engine bay to make sure that your ground is good. So the fix for you is probably going to be to replace your ground strap. On an E46, they have this nice sheathing over it, and everything's sealed, and these usually don't go bad unless, you know, the stud rusts out or something like that. I had a lot of corrosion here, but it wasn't causing a voltage drop before I took it apart. So for yours, take a look at your ground strap and post in the comments. Let me know if that helped you solve it. Hopefully it does. And thanks for watching. Hopefully this is going to help some other people out there with same situations. Now, it's very common on the X3, but it's also common on other BMWs that use the same style ground strap, and I think that's some X5s as well. So definitely check your engine ground before you replace your starter. All right, Dave, take care, and everyone else, thanks for watching.